Yeah, so being the Festival Ideas, there are actually two ideas I really want to get across today, and I apologise if you're still at the end of this slightly lost as to why I describe myself as being of no fixed national abode. But I'll try to get some other things across which might give you a clue to why that's the case. There's really two things I want to express today, two ideas. One is poverty is a symptom of relational dysfunction. And the other is that relationships should be economically significant. And in both cases, I'll be zeroing particularly on the way in which family answers both these criteria in relation to poverty. So where do we start with poverty? Because there's so many different ways to look at the issue, so many arguments about how you measure it, how you define it. But one of the easiest ways to start, I think, is just thinking of personal experience. I think everyone has been in a situation where they've been asked for something, or they've come across someone, especially in the street, who's needed something from them. Or if you're a parent, you've been in a situation where your child has needed something from you. And of course, as soon as you use that example, you realize that all of us have also been in need. All of us have been in situations where we've needed something from someone else, and we've been helpless, and we've been totally dependent on what other people can provide for us. And I think if we start from this perspective of need as being something that we all experience is actually quite a good way into poverty. Even at a governmental level, I mean, it's easy to look at certain countries and say, oh, they're really sort of failing or doing badly, but of course the UK always run on a budget deficit. In other words, we're always asking people for stuff. And so, like most people, I spent the first sort of half of my life, of course there's a different proportion the older you get, but I've spent the first half of my life being mainly dependent on other people. And of course the older I got, the more I experienced myself being asked help from others. And I want to share a story with you to get into how some of these ideas work, which really strikes me as important to illustrate what it is for someone to be in need and how I learned to try to respond to this. So I was teaching in a college and I was asked for help by this guy called Shad. And he seemed to be the sort of guy in his late teens. He sort of presented himself well, was very well spoken. And all he really wanted was to have a bit of a hand with his academic work. And me having 2 or whatever 3 degrees that, to be honest, sit a lot of the time on the shelf, and I wonder what they're there for, thinking, okay, I can actually use some of this stuff I've learned to help someone, which is great. So I volunteered a bit of time, spent some time helping the guy out with his exam work, and over a period of time, it occurred to me, I could begin to see that things were really not okay with Shad. Like, stuff at home was really bad. In fact, he didn't really have home per se. He was staying by himself. He was staying in this little pokey room that he had to scrape rent together for. It turned out actually that he couldn't live with his mum anymore, and his cousin had chucked him out because her boyfriend didn't get on with him. And so he was living this life, actually, when you looked at it, he was living well below any measure of poverty, actually, including the sort of $1.25 a day thing. But the thing about it, he had something about him which was kind of different to a lot of the lads I knew, because he really had this drive for things to change. He really could envisage a different future for himself, even though it wasn't coming into any sort of reality in most of his life. And he was a Christian as well, and I'm Christian, and one of the things we did together was made this little group. A few of us would meet, have a bit of food down his house. It was a pretty rough part of town. Some of the other guys would come along, and we'd just read, sort of discuss what was in the Bible together and share it a bit. And I started to see, actually, even though he's trying to finish his schooling, he's not really going to get anywhere, because so much of his time and energy is spent sort of scraping together whatever he could get to make ends meet. Basically, he was cooking off this little camp stove type thing. He didn't have a fridge, so he was having to cook obviously every day. Couldn't keep stuff in the fridge. So I began to think, what if he could finish his education in some type of boarding? That would sort of solve this problem, because he would have this sort of food and his shelter there, and he could just get down to his studying. And weirdly enough, he'd had this same idea, and he sort of sheepishly mentioned it to me. So somehow or other, managed to get together the funds so that he could finish his education. And it went really, really well. So like from starting off quite far behind the other people in school, he began to really catch up. He worked really hard, but so things went pear-shaped. Things went pear-shaped. He started hanging around with the wrong lads. He got into a bit of trouble, started nicking stuff, started using all kinds of weird substances, and got into a few scraps. And actually, things got so bad that he got expelled. And I was the one, so even though he was 18, so he's technically an adult, I was the one that had to sort things out, because I was the one that sorted out his fees. So I went to sort that out, and if I'm honest, I wanted to strangle him. Completely wanted to strangle him. And I was like, all right, that's it. You've had your chance, mate. There's no way in which I'm gonna waste more time and money. But this sort of feeling of being prodded continued, whereby I thought, hang on, where I was staying at the time, I had a spare room. There was a comp around the corner. What was to stop him actually moving in and finishing school there? And I was like, I do not want to do this. I was doing a pretty intense job at the time. I needed my space. The last thing I needed was to have someone else to think about in the house. But Christians might recognize this feeling. The prodding continued until I couldn't really give in anymore. So I said to him, okay, well, do you want to have another shot? But there's got to be ground rules. So I became like this really annoying older brother that was more or less ground him at certain times. I have a curfew. We made all sorts of arrangements and made sure he wouldn't run about with the wrong lads. Wouldn't get involved in gang stuff again, because that happens really easily in different parts. And things started changing. We started up the Bible studies again, as we were having before. He began making better friends. He also actually began rebuilding relationship with his family, because he'd run into his mum just totally at random in a hospital. He hadn't seen her in over 3 years, and he built up that relationship. So gradually all these sort of relationships were beginning to build up, and he did really well. He was nearly literally flying. I say nearly literally because he actually wanted to be an aeronautical engineer, which is pretty ambitious. He didn't quite get the grades for that, but he got into a decent mechanical engineering course. And he was able then to move out. He started up a little side business selling stuff, legal stuff, I should say, and made enough money to sort of look after himself when he was doing his course. And that's where I left him, because my contract finished at that time. I moved out of the area. Of course, I still kept in touch with him. He's like my little brother. So what's the point of this story? I mean, the first thing is this, that if you looked at his situation, here's a young guy living off peanuts, got next to nothing, and just think, right, he's got no money, we'll chuck some money at him. That's the problem. And that is a gut reaction, which is understandable. Not enough money, give him some money. What's going to happen? What's going to happen if you give him money? Best case scenario, and this doesn't often happen, best case scenario is he'll use it, get an education, and be able to become independent. But even in his case, even when he had this chance of a really pretty decent education in the end, it went pear-shaped, it went wrong. Why is that? It's because that situation, especially in the institutionalized environment of the school, that didn't actually solve the problems that had led to him being in poverty in the first place. Like it was his family had broken down. Like the sort of social and emotional wounds that he'd undergone, and the more I heard about it, the worse it got. Some of the stuff he'd been through as family. That was never going to be solved just by giving money, just by going to school. And sort of his need for sort of affirmation, being part of a group, like being able to feel like he was really part of something, that came out in the wrong way. And that's why he got involved in the kind of gang stuff he did. Of course, he had a choice. I'm not saying that he had no choice. He did have a choice. But you can see how that sort of emotional brokenness, it needs more than just money. And money wasn't going to solve it. And the problem with a lot of approaches to poverty, I find, is that they miss this relational aspect, especially the family aspect, actually. I don't know how aware you were of this at the time. Back in November last year, a guy called Philip Alston, an Australian working for the UN, came across to visit the UK and do a report about the extent of poverty here. And it kicked off quite a lot in the media because of some of the things he said. You can see what the Telegraph quoted him as saying. He didn't quite say that actually in his report, but that was certainly the drift of some of the things he wrote. And he basically says, listen, there should be a safety net in the UK. It's a world-renowned place where welfare state is strong, and that's being eroded. And he noted these problems, especially child poverty, homelessness, and actually lack of care for the elderly, the three things. The problem I've got is that all those three things are both symptoms and really helped by family dynamics. And at never at any point in his report does he ever say, well, perhaps there's actually an issue here with families themselves that could be addressed. His answer was, okay, we're just going to plow more cash into the benefit system. Benefits can help people, but of course, what it doesn't do is provide all the things I try to illustrate with Shad, all the things that people actually gain from being in close relationships. And there's plenty of indications that reliance on benefits it becomes extremely unhealthy the longer it goes on for. Not least because it connects you directly to the state without connecting to other people sometimes. And it can help people. It can also serve to weaken some of these bonds which are really life-giving. So how did the government reply? You can see Amber Rudd there. I don't know if this picture is actually her replying, but I'm pretty sure she would have looked like this because the reply was pretty angry if you read the report of the UN meeting in Geneva. She basically denies the whole thing, and the basis of denying it is that employment is at record high in the UK. In other words, as long as people work, which they were, on balance, employment was high, then all these problems of poverty can't possibly be the case. Of course, working is a good thing. Working is a profoundly good thing, and it can easily be underemphasized how good it is for people's overall well-being to work. That's really important. But the trouble is, to say work at any cost is to miss the point of what work actually should give you. Firstly, it misses the point that a lot of the poverty that's pointed out was actually from families that were in work. So it wasn't just unemployed people, it was families that were already working, which means that it's not any job that will do. And in particular types of jobs, very often are jobs, we talk so much about the gig economy nowadays, but the kind of jobs that don't give you any stability, the kind of jobs that actually increase your mobility, which itself is a bad thing for the relationships in the family. And also the kinds of jobs that don't give you any real sense of being part of something, of being satisfied, actually of being happy, which is again what underlies that sort of government response is, okay, if they're employed, they're getting money, which means they're happy. So it's missing a whole set of really important connections. But this isn't just a UK problem, and actually if you look at the global scale, you get a very similar set of responses to things. So this is something which at least some of you here will remember, which is Live Aid. And this picture, especially that kind of image there, the stereotypical kind of poor African picture, became really etched in people's consciousnesses is what Africa is about. And again, this basic knee-jerk reaction. They don't have enough stuff, let's send more stuff. However well-meaning or not Bob Geldof was, what was completely missing in the media, and it was brought out in subsequent reports, was the fact that the civil war in Ethiopia at the time meant that just ploughing money into certain people's accounts was not going to go directly to the people who actually needed it. And in fact, the civil war itself, and of course the very real political and military actors involved in it, were the ones that were causing the situation of poverty to be exacerbated. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It wasn't just like there's not enough stuff. It was politically exacerbated, and if you look at the map of where it's most severe, it's no coincidence it's around rebel territory where it's most severe. That's just one example of the way in which we think of poverty. Okay, just fix this problem with money, rather than looking at the relationships, in this case political relationships, that are actually causing the problem, the relationships that are dysfunctional. Dambisa Moyo, she's a Zambian economist, has brought out this issue on an even bigger plane. She says it's not just the kind of Live Aid thing that Bob Geldof does that's problematic, but it's the whole pattern of governments making 0.7% of their budget or whatever, something which is then transferred directly into other governments' economies. And she says this, and she's pretty hard-hitting. Aid's been and continues to be an unmitigated political, economic, and humanitarian disaster for most parts of the developing world. And what she means by that is simply the fact that if you look at where the most aid has gone, that's often where the least development has taken place, both in economic and political terms, actually, which is important. I wouldn't necessarily go with all her solutions to this. They're sort of classic neoliberal solutions to the problem, although one really important thing she does say is to stop this practice of countries like the US, and the EU do this as well, slapping big subsidies into their grain production, so that it makes it impossible for countries like Malawi and Tanzania to compete with these grain prices on the global market. That's a really important thing. Others of the solutions I'm not quite sure about, but I'm not an economist anyway, so I'm not expert enough to properly judge them. The point is clear though. The question is this: what could possibly perpetuate this kind of misdiagnosis of such a fundamental human issue? Why is it that time and time again this sort of approach seems to be taken, which basically one way or another says that, okay, poverty is a problem, money is the answer? Well, anyone who's lucky enough to have sat through a course in economics, or at least tried to read a textbook like this, will very quickly have come across this thing called the rational consumer, which is the basic presupposition of how people act in a sort of financial situation, which then provides the baseline kind of model for all the charts and graphs, which I cannot understand whatsoever, that these guys draw up. Now, this is premised on two things about personhood, about anthropology, that I think we should question. First one is this idea of being autonomous, as if you're sort of in this self-contained bubble where then you make your decisions from there based on what's best. The fact is that we should know this, but our relationships shape who we are, shape our choices. There's this African saying, it's a bit stereotyped because it certainly doesn't describe everything about Africa at all, but I am because we are. In other words, the very constitution of my identity has got to do with how I relate to other people. And of course, instinctively we know there's something in this. When we stop being that way, actually, it leads very quickly to problems. The other thing is this materialist assumption here, as if all of our decisions are based on this drive to optimize our resources. Of course, we do that. We need food, we need shelter, we need drink, somehow think we need iPhones. But is this really what drives us? Can we really narrow down our decisions that we make in any given day because it will maximize our resources? You know, how many of you actually are becoming richer by coming to this right now instead of doing all the other things you could be doing? Even I could be doing other things to make me rich. I can't think for a minute what that would be, but still, I could at least consider it. We just don't make our decisions based on this sort of coldly materialist base. And actually, one really interesting thing, if you read the statistics that the Office of National Statistics have published, especially the 2014-15 ones on this brings this out, that the places in the UK with the highest income are in one table, and places in the UK with the highest sense of well-being, however that's measured, are in another table. And they're more or less flipped. So that London's at the top of the income one, and then North East and Northern Ireland at the bottom. Then when you get to well-being more generally, Northern Ireland, North East come out on top, London's at the bottom. That's not to say that poverty doesn't cause misery. It does. Destitution and poverty certainly do. But that situation of extreme destitution is still relatively small percentage. What we're talking about is being above a certain level. And once you get above a certain level, actually more and more stuff does not make you happier. It's no coincidence that the Northeast and Northern Ireland, which are both places I've lived, have the strongest sort of sense of community and family structure about it. They're both known as being friendly places for a reason. That itself has its nuances too, especially in the issue of racism, which happens to be a particular problem in both places. So the point is we're really questioning a whole personhood here, and I would really wanted to describe something more like a relational personhood. I hope you can see what I've done there. I thought it was pretty clever. But what we got to be careful of is in rejecting this false idea of personhood, that we don't replace it with something which is worse. Firstly, we need to be careful of this tendency to be collectivized in our view of personhood. So in saying we're not autonomous is not to say we don't have individual choice. Again, instinctively, we know we have individual choice, and we've got responsibility for that choice. And the fact that we're relationally shaped as people doesn't diminish that. It just tempers it. But the other thing is this, that the problem with something like relational personhood is it can sound very nebulous and fluffy, can't it? It can sound like, okay, well, life's all about relationships, which is kind of great for your interior being. It's great for your sense of feeling happy. But how can this actually deal with the hard reality of material life? How can this possibly have an impact on the sort of economic issues that I've been raising? And this is where I come to the second big point here, that relationships themselves should be economically significant. They shouldn't be this separation between relationships and economic life. And illustrate this again from this story with Shad. You know, his situation of poverty was directly because he'd been cut off from the family networks that should have sustained him. He couldn't live with his mum anymore. She moved in with this other bloke, and he got kicked out of his cousin's place. And those were not just like optional extras for his emotional well-being. Those networks were the ones through which he should have been provided the material things that he needed for his life. And they were taken away. And I think anyone who has had to look after children will instinctively know that this relationship is an extremely holistic thing. There's no sense in which you can separate care for someone's physical and emotional and social and spiritual needs and just say, well, actually it's only one of these which is important. Instinctively, you know it's got to be all of them, because all of them are what make up a person. So why is it when we look at the issue of poverty and economics that we still actually separate these two, as if economics happens on one plane and then relationships, especially family relationships, happening on a total other plane? I think a lot of it has to do with this way of thinking of wealth by GDP. Because GDP, of course, is, however well it might measure certain aspects of economic activity, it completely misses out, especially care which is taking place in families. And globally speaking, it's women's work that doesn't get accounted for. This is why in the Oxfam Inequality Report that you might have read this year, one of the big things they emphasize is the gap in wealth between genders. The point is not that men do more work than women, but men control a massive amount more of the wealth than women. Why? Because women's work is not represented in financial or GDP terms. And part of the consequence of that, I think, for our thinking, is that we tend to imagine that the economy is something which takes place in a separate realm to family relationships, but they're not. Family relationships are economically significant. And again, you just have to look at the amount of money the government has to put into elderly care when they're in state-provided facilities compared to how much they put in when they're being looked after in homes, which, by the way, happens a lot in the UK, but generally not in British families, usually in families which have come from cultures where that still is the practice, and it works much better, actually, for everyone. So, poverty is a symptom of relational dysfunction, and in order for us to address poverty through relationships, these relationships have to be recognized as being economically significant. And I hope these two ideas are starting to make some sense, but still you might be sort of thinking, what holds them together? Is there any sort of coherent view that can put them in a sort of a bigger system? Because at the moment it's the kind of thing that I could quite happily make a YouTube channel about, but it's unlikely to have any purchase in the world. Is it even rooted in any sort of deeper intellectual tradition? Actually it is. And one of the things that you might have picked up on is the importance of Christianity in all this. I'm coming at this as a Christian. And Christianity, of course, has been one of the main traditions of thought that's had to grapple with the issue of social care, of social change, of poverty itself. Often well, often badly. And it was this grappling with the core Christian message which actually worked itself out in the story I told you about Shad earlier. That was kind of me really trying to work out, how does this gospel message about Jesus dying for our sins, and I'd experienced the freedom that was, along with thousands of people throughout history. I understood that freedom, but then the question was, okay, well, what's the opposite of that? Is it just not sinning? It's not particularly helpful, is it? And in fact, the classic Christian answer is not sinning. It's actually love. Love for God and love for neighbour. And so the question is, well, how does this love for neighbour actually work itself out in a context of extreme poverty? And everything I told you about Shad actually happened between 2011 and 2015 in Malawi. I was there teaching in a theological college, and then doing some of the sort of work that I described informally, kind of on the side. And I think probably the best place to sum up the biblical view on this is, well, there's two things. One is to look at the bigger kind of picture it gives us. And this, I'd have to interpret a little bit. This is a sort of relational diagram between God and people, people and themselves, people and others, and people and the rest of creation. And the idea is, what the Bible's doing is to try to show how these relationships are what actually make up reality. And once these get messed, as happened, then all kinds of things go wrong there. And the environment is the one that people are particularly conscious of at the moment, as having gone completely wrong the way we treat the environment. Completely wrong. But it's part of this bigger network of other things going wrong as well. It's no coincidence that in a lot of places where there's the most environmental degradation, that people are suffering the most. People are losing their land. People are being treated politically the worst at the same time. And this all relates back to what Christians refer to as sin, as the fall, this fundamental break with God. And probably if there's one place you can't, Bible's a long book, it's a long series of books. How do you sum up what it says in this? These words I would pick out from the New Testament. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ has laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. But if anyone has the world's good and sees his brother or sister in need, yet closes their hearts against them, how does God's love abide in that person? And the point of this is to get away from this idea, which has been there in different Christian traditions in a problematic way, that love is a sort of nebulous or spiritual thing or a disembodied thing. It's not. Very straightforwardly, the way it's supposed to be expressed is actually in relationships to those in need. And the use of the term brothers and sisters, it's one word in Greek, adelphoi, is pointing to the fact that this happens within essentially a family structure. Of course, it's not literally a blood family in the sense that I've been describing some of these things. But the point is that family type of mentality actually pervades in society at a wider level. It's actually in the Old Testament where this has worked out better in relation to society. So I want to take you a little bit further back to Israel. It's really quite difficult to represent Moses giving the Ten Commandments. So this is one of the many sort of graphic representations you get. That it's not as if you had iPhones at the time, otherwise someone would have filmed him doing it. What he did was to give what we call Torah, the law. And the idea is not completely different at all from the New Testament. The same point, it starts from God initiates things. He saves Israel actually from basically being an underclass of slave labor in Egypt. That's a situation they were saved from, is a political, economic situation. He saves them out of this, gives them the law, and gives them a whole structure for the way society is supposed to work. And not least the economic part. That's really, really important when you read through the Old Testament. And the reason it tends to take on a family type of structure is because it literally originates from actually one person. Got this Abraham. So Abraham is actually called a friend of God, which is a pretty amazing phrase to use. You got Abraham, and then from him you get his grandson Jacob, and then his great-grandchildren give all the names to the tribes of Israel. And these are the tribes which then land is divided between. And within every tribal patch of land, the idea that is every family should have a patch of land which they farm, so they're economic producers, and which they then are able to trade with their excess. Now, when you think of family, we're not really thinking of the sort of traditional nuclear model that has become sort of common here. It's broader than that in two ways. Firstly, it would nearly always incorporate 3 generations who would live, if not in the same house, then certainly in the same little compound. And the second way is it's broader because households would quite often include people who are not in any way blood relatives. It was actually a far more complex idea of household than we sometimes give the Christian view credit for. And the idea is within this you would have what you might call sort of labourers or even domestic workers. The question of slavery is obviously a very tough one for anyone reading the Old Testament. And all I'd say about slavery is that there's a real change that takes place from this structure, the way it was set up, where they weren't supposed to have forced labour at all. There certainly were people who were working in domestic labour, but there wasn't supposed to be forced labour. And where you get that forced labour really coming in is in the centralisation that the monarchy brought. Sort of paradoxically, it's the kind of high point of Israel economically is also the low point, because that's when you get what we would later think of as being human rights abuses, actually. And there's this very strong connection between idolatry and a willingness to oppress people who are weaker. This is why you get these kinds of lines. This is Ezekiel. He's one of the prophets who would basically speak out against the power structures in Israel when things started going pear-shaped, which they did. And he said this: "You've become guilty by the blood that you've shed and defiled by the idols that you've made." So that's the idolatry. "And the people of the land have practiced extortion and committed robbery. They've oppressed the poor and needy, and they've extorted from the foreigner, denying them justice." And a lot of the reason why this happened is that the structures that were supposed to be built around kinship and that love which families are supposed to cultivate began to be replaced by more or less an aggressive, consumerist, expansionist kind of way of thinking. And that's one of the ways in which things went really, really wrong for Israel. Now, in the New Testament, this is a sort of visual representation of Pentecost. Again, it's pretty hard to represent exactly how it would look. The New Testament, you get a different situation, because instead of like a nation-state configuration, as Israel was, followers of Jesus would have come from every background, and they would have joined the original Jewish church, because the church was originally Jewish. But it wasn't structured around, as I say, a nation-state in the same way anymore. And in which case you got this growth of people coming from everywhere with all different languages, although they had at least a common language of Greek they could communicate with. And they still live by the same principles. So a lot of the reason why you don't get as much in the New Testament about the economic stuff is because it's assumed that those principles still apply. Only that they have to apply in a different situation. And what you get, which is kind of unique, is the first ever example apparently anywhere in history. It's a hard thing to ascertain, but I'm told by someone who studied at least ancient history a lot that international aid first came in within the church. You get this collection of aid being organized from parts of Greece down to Jerusalem, because there was a food shortage there. And there was a bit of emergency aid that had to be temporarily administered there. And that was done through the church, apparently the first time it happened, because it was totally moving beyond the traditional way of seeing kinship, but working within a new kinship, a new family structure, which the church defined. And there's the one thing to mention actually about the New Testament which is different, is we get a deeper sense of why it is that our anthropology, or our sense of personhood, is relational. And that's because it actually points to God as being relational. In other words, you get hints of this in the Old Testament. It's really much more fully spread out in the New Testament, where you get God, who in God's self is Father, Son, and Spirit. So these three persons. And so the relational nature of God is then communicated to people through us being in His image. That's the New Testament perspective. So as we draw to a bit of a close here, you might be suspicious of applying any of a kind of biblical perspective to an economic vision for society today. The Church's track records in such matters has been mixed. And all I would say on that is consider that actually a lot of what's been really good in what the Church has done has been when it's been on a smaller scale and less likely to be actually that prevalent in the textbooks we read. Where it's gone really wrong, it's been at a massive scale. It's been quite often when there's been a temptation to overstep bounds of power that should have been germane to the Church and take it to a place which has become corrupt. So what could we say in any sort of practical, real-world way about these two principles of poverty that I've been trying to set out? One is this. Actually, someone called David Cameron, you may remember this guy. He was around a few years ago. He made some mistakes. So he said this: families are the best anti-poverty measure ever invented. They're a welfare, education, and counselling system all wrapped up into one. You could take a hermeneutic of suspicion to that and say, well, he's just shrinking the state, he's trying to reduce the government's responsibility for people. But if you take it on its most positive basis, it's actually profoundly true. It's profoundly true that when families actually do perform these functions well, it has a massive impact on people's well-being and on their lives. Of course, the problem is, it's one thing to say this, but none of the things which would have led to this actually being strengthened were done by the government. In fact, there was more or less a systematic failure to implement what they call the family test, which was a way of looking at policies in terms of its relationships to families. It was not implemented at all. And if you read the 2017 manifesto, there's even less of an emphasis on this kind of thinking. Theresa May doesn't repeat anything which you would recognize as being from this kind of thinking. So they said this, they didn't do it. Thinking about aid now, I won't repeat what Dambisa Moyo said, but it's just worth keeping in mind that we pride ourselves as being a country that gives 0.7 of GDP to foreign aid and development. Just ask ourselves, where is that really going, and what could be a better way to look at our relationship with other countries? Small example, Malawi. The tax deal which British companies have with Malawi in terms of how they deal with their income there, that was negotiated before independence between the British government in London and a British governor in the Longway in Malawi. And that's still been, and the reason why that's stalled, and I've written to MPs several times to encourage them to get this moving again, but they're like, oh, Brexit's happening, we can't concentrate on anything else, and which is true. It's one of the tragedies of Brexit that it has done this. So that issue still hasn't been fixed. Second thing, so not government, but now look at ourselves as individuals or families. I think a family shouldn't be seen as something that hinders our economic progress. It's too easy to see it that way. But care for relatives is actually a crucial part of the economy. And if we see it this way, I think it begins to change things. And again, government could help by incentivizing this care far more than they do. I would also say this, that think in terms of consumer habits. A lot of the way in which we buy things and look at what we buy and think about it are really disconnected from the reality of people's lives on the other side. But you begin thinking of people as mothers or sons or even children who are making our goods, producing our goods in our supply chain. It changes our whole relationship. It changes the choices we make. It changes the kind of things we find important. And it should lead to a different way of approaching our buying, actually. I'm not sure why that's there. That's a completely random slide. Hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to close by this. What became of Shad? Well, I'm still in touch with Shad's family, but actually unfortunately, he was in this accident, and I'll not talk a lot about it, but he was in an accident. He died 3 years ago. And I'm confident I'll see him again. And the reason for this is actually the reason that got Paul in trouble at the very first Festival of Ideas, which was in Athens. Paul stood up at this Festival of Ideas. We're talking to first century philosophers. And when he started talking about resurrection, things kicked off a bit. Didn't go so well. And I just want to commend this to you, the resurrection of Jesus, not just as an idea, but as an event. And an event which sends life pulsating through the otherwise fatal symptom of poverty. Thanks very much.